Hello, everybody. I hope you've had a good week or two off. I've missed being in class and missed seeing all of your faces. And, well, you should be midway through your British poetry history, or at least some of the reading list. I'm going to pick up where I left off in class at the as far as historical context is concerned, at the Battle of Hastings and the Norman invasion of 1066, which, if you remember properly, I had mentioned that it was a significant date in history for the island of England. It's kind of the big motivating factor for English to really see its influence of French and English combine to make a language. Let's kind of review a little bit. Let me get a marker. So first and foremost, sorry about the blurriness, we have the Briton people. These are the natives, and I'm sorry if that's backwards. I can't write backwards, so unfortunately. But we have the Briton people. I'm sorry that ended up backwards. Didn't know that was going to happen, but, you know, reflective lenses on cameras. We have the Briton people. They're the native folks. They are invaded by the Saxons, who are normally considered Vikings. Then we have the Danes and the Jutes, the Jutes being from the Jutland Peninsula up in the very northern part near what is now modern-day Norway, Finland, and that area that's kind of the eastern tip of Russia, Norway, Finland, and those countries. Then we have the Danes, which are from Daneland. We all know them as the Dutch now, coming down. And then France and Spain, which are some more Germanic peoples at this time period, invading into England. After that, it's a period of unrest and crazy kingdom alignments, and then 1066 happens. It's one of the most pivotal dates in English history. William of Normandy, known in places as William the Bastard, other places also known as William the Conqueror, landed from modern-day France with a massive invading force. And they are all written in a book called the Domesday Book. If you're interested in ancestry, genealogy, if you have any kind of English or French in your background, and this would be the place to look if you have any heraldry or knights. Big wealthy landowners, because most of them landed from Normandy with William, and they defeated the last kind of Anglo-Saxon and Danish forces controlling the island. They invaded from the south and pretty much wiped them all out at the Battle of Hastings, and on Christmas Day in 1066 William was crowned king. It united the island all the way around from north to south and established English heraldry as well as French as the language of the court. So we haven't really reached English yet. We still have the Beowulf English that I talked about, but French would be the language of the aristocracy at this point in time period. This would become known as the Middle English period. Middle English is best seen in Geoffrey Chaucer, William of Langland. Any of those two authors, William Langland writes some very interesting stuff about both in poetry and in prose. But Geoffrey Chaucer is probably the most well-known poet of this time with the Canterbury Tales. If you want to read some salacious, weird stuff, the Canterbury Tales, the Wife of Bath, she's a real interesting lady. She basically marries for money, marries for sex. Really kind of a filthy lady. She has some dirty jokes in there. She makes fun of people. Get you an annotated version of that. That way you can see what they're actually saying, because the language still doesn't quite resemble the modern language that we know today, but it is close enough to where you should be able to pick out some of the words. it's still, I call English, what we know as modern English, is in a development period and will be for the next few hundred years. Chaucer was a well-connected civil servant whose works were familiar all over England due to his connections to the English crown, and using alliterative verse much in the same way the previous Anglo-Saxon tradition does. Chaucer and his imitators sought to entertain large groups of people and spent the focus of his poetry on famous stories of the time or tawdry sexual themes, because even our ancestors like to get down and dirty. By the beginning of the 1500s is when we really start. So almost 500 years later, 450, I'm sorry, I'm an English teacher, not a math teacher. William Caxton's printing press gets introduced to England, and the ability for the working classes to have literature available to them and become better educated really starts to see the English language that we know today come to fruition. So the reign of Elizabeth I, one of the Tudor lines after the War of the Roses, interesting time period. If you've ever watched The Tudors on HBO, are interested in Game of Thrones, a lot of this time period is based on those works of fiction. But it's at this point we really start to see English poetry start to develop with Billy Shakespeare, Edmund Spenser, Sir Philip Sidney, Thomas Campion, and Christopher Marlowe, and Ben Jonson. You should have a good number of selections on your English reading list to pick from. Spenser's masterwork, The Faerie Queene, is an early example of what's known as pastoral poetry that deals primarily with themes of pastures, nature and love, really. There is an old, I would say, Greek-Roman philosopher poet named Ovid that was really widely read at this time period as part of the classical education of the time period. And Ovid works his way into the Faerie Queene and also into primarily most of Shakespeare's work. Sidney, Spenser, and ultimately Shakespeare are credited with creating several innovation style traditions that we now know as the old boring stuffy poetry. Shakespeare is credited with creating the Shakespearian or English sonnet, at least making it popular. He did not create it, but he definitely made it popular. In most cases, they take literary traditions from the continent of Europe, again, conquering forces, bringing things with them. They're taking these traditions and they're molding them into their own. They're breaking traditions or kind of skewing them in their own way. For instance, Shakespeare takes the Italian sonnet, Petrarchan sonnet, as we've learned in close form, and perverts it a little bit. He mixes up the rhyme scheme, he plays with the form, sticks with the pentameter, iambic pentameter, but definitely messes with the end rhyme and internal rhyme, which hadn't really been used yet with Petrarchan. In 1576, James Burbage builds his famous theater in Shoreditch, outside the city limits of London. London's theater becomes the home of poetic and literary performance over the next half century. Pretty much anybody that's either a poet or an actor ends up in that theater. James Burbage actually is one of the primary influences on Shakespeare's theater work. Shakespeare himself was actually a very poor actor, and even though he did act, James Burbage was not. He was considered, the top echelon actor of his time period. Think of Daniel Day-Lewis with no films, but definitely considered one of the most well-respected, well-rounded actors of his time period. And he funded a theater. He was a layman at this point in time period. This is one of the few ways that somebody who came from commoner background could make a fortune or at least make a living, either as a writer or an actor. What's more important is that both king and commoner alike loved coming to the theater. It was a place where both could be entertained. Obviously, there was different seating arrangements. The rich would be up here in the top portion of the theater, and down here in the mosh pit, as we now see it or call it, is where all the poor folks would be at. So there would be really no wall between who was being entertained. Everybody was getting their own version of entertainment at some point. The other thing to be noted by the beginning of the 1500s is that modern English that we now know, even though we consider Shakespeare and Spenser and Sidney, even folks a little bit later on in the 1700s to be very difficult to read, they're actually speaking the same language that we are. They're straight ahead, straightforward. Although those words may have become archaic, you can look them up in an Oxford English dictionary, and they will be there, and you will be able to understand them, versus the English that was spoken by just 500 years prior with Geoffrey Chaucer, and thousands of years before that with Beowulf. You would not be able to recognize those words. They're entirely different for the most part. So the language begins to move away from the more Germanic roots of Old English, the French roots of Middle English, and now has become its own kind of imperial language. It becomes the language of the court. Becomes defined as a world language and a living language by the 17th century. 17th century England was dominated by a group known as the Metaphysicals, or the metaphysical poets. These folks were very philosophical. They dealt with God and hell, human nature, the human spirit, and how they work. John Donne, his female counterpart, Amelia Lanier, George Herbert, and John Milton, whose most well-known work is Paradise Lost, that deals with God and Satan. Very interesting work, and it's written all in poetic form. It's actually a poetic epic. They're the primary figures of this time period. Everyone else is a lesser poet. So if you get back to 1600s England and are finding a new poet from this time period that isn't Herbert, Milton, Donne, and then Lanier, she was primarily the very first female English poet that was well respected in all circles. You're not going to find much of poetry outside of those four figures. Milton's epic poem, Paradise Lost, has been the subject of academic debate since its publication. Donne's poetic shift in the beginning of his life is as beautiful as it is dramatic. John Donne's one of my personal favorites because in the early portion of his life, he was kind of this crazy, sexually driven man, all about spending time with different lovers. And by the end of his life, he had lost his sight. He'd been devoted to one woman his entire life, and she dies. Donne himself almost dies, and he comes into conflict with his Christian beliefs. His poems, his sonnets, especially near the end of his life, are very personally reflective. If anybody is a Metallica fan, Metallica has used some of Donne's poetry as inspiration for some of their lyrics, especially their earlier lyrics. James Hetfield was especially influenced by the poem For Whom the Bell Tolls, which went on to become a very famous song in Metallica's early catalog. Lanier, one of the very first female poets of notoriety in England, stands equally gifted to her male counterparts and has seen many of her works being placed in the British canon over the last 50 years. Up until 1950, nobody had really ever studied her, and then they figured out, hey, she's John Milton's equal, really, as far as gift with verse and as far as thematic instruction goes. The metaphysical poets are characterized by their use of what are called conceits, or an extended paradoxical analogy. They have a great emphasis on spoken rather than lyrical quality to their work. While they're often said to deal with ideas of religion, philosophy, and existential ideas, due to their loose association and broad themes, this term can be a bit misleading. While they do primarily deal with those things, they also deal with love and sex and nature as well. The English Civil War would color the middle portion of the 1600s, primarily the overthrow of the crown. Would see I would say a darkening of English art at this time period due to the puritanical beliefs of the English civil government. It would be a time period of significant conflict and change. British colonization over many parts of the world, civil unrest at home with reestablishment of the monarchy eventually, and major discoveries in science would all lead to massive thematic shifts. Another blow to poetry's popularity would be the rise of the idea of the prose novel. It's not until the 1700s that the English novel is born. Daniel Defoe with Robinson Crusoe, Robert Louis Stevenson, Treasure Island, Samuel Richardson's Pamela are all examples of prose fiction that really dominated the public conscience because it hadn't been, the idea of poetry was the predominant literary form for England for 1600 plus years. And now there's this crazy thing called the novel where people are telling a story over an extended amount of periods, a period and pages, and the fact that poetry had kind of been seen as this lascivious thing from the Puritan government. With the Metaphysicals, after that we have what's called the Age of Reason in England, where people are really preoccupied with science, not so much with religion. The Great Awakening to Science with Newton, and many of the physicists of the 1700s really caused poetry to fall out of vogue. People were looking for a more literal sense to language. They were looking for a more literal sense of storytelling. So they decided that poetry was no longer fitting for that. So they switched to the novel. However, there was a gentleman that was fairly popular at the time, Alexander Pope. He was a satirist. He liked to make fun of people. And the way that he did it was through poetry. His Rape of the Lock is a mock epic, making fun of all these epic poems like Milton and Beowulf. And it is of notable skill. And if you get the jokes, it's kind of funny. It's said to be the equivalent to Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal in poetic form. If you know anything about Swift's A Modest Proposal, he actually proposes to the English government that the Irish should donate their children to be eaten. That's right, eat babies. It's crazy, but it was a way for Swift to mock the English government's treatment of the Irish people. It's kind of funny when you look at it that way, but that's what he's advocating for, that babies make sweeter meat, so to speak, that we should fatten them up with a little bit of food and then roast them and stick them in a stew. That's odd. By the end of the 1700s, rapid social reforms happen all across the board. Ireland, England, Scotland, political revolutions on the continent and with the Americans across the sea makes poetry kind of come back in vogue. Odd how that works. The idea of romanticism, not romantic poetry in the sense of love, but romanticism. It's a movement that begins in France, and it makes its way across to England and brings about a rebirth in poetry. It starts with William Blake, then William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Percy Bysshe Shelley, George Gordon Lord Byron, John Keats. These are all considered to be the pinnacle authors of this movement. It tried to create a new kind of poetry that emphasized intuition over reason and the pastoral of the urban over the urban. The idea of eschewing consciously poetic language in an effort to be more colloquial or talking a more common language. So they're getting away from all this stuffy, wordy stuff that we had seen with Sidney and Shakespeare and Milton. These guys wanted to talk regularly, like real dudes, so to speak. There weren't many women a part of this movement, unfortunately. They wanted to talk about how getting back to nature and getting closer to nature and getting away from the machinations of an industrialized society was actually killing our individuality, killing our society. The idea that, man versus nature is probably the most beautiful thing that can take place in humanity. So they really kind of take a stab at all of the Enlightenment thought of science and say, nah, science doesn't really explain everything. They really don't like religion either. Most of these folks were either very skeptical of religion or atheists. particularly Shelley and Coleridge. Coleridge was an interesting character. He really, really liked opium. Really liked it. I mean, you think potheads are bad. Coleridge really went off the deep end. This guy, if you read Kubla Khan, which is basically an ode to opium, and his Rime to the Ancient Mariner, which is extremely long. It's probably the closest thing to a romantic epic poem that we get from this time period. It really goes off the deep end as to what it means to be human, what it means to be man, and battling and fighting with the romantic side of our life with nature. So it clashes with classical forms. These guys really didn't like to write in forms, although our old buddy John Keats liked to write odes a lot. He's the predecessor to the emo movement in music. Everything is an ode. Oh, beautiful this, or oh, beautiful that. He wrote an ode to an urn. The Grecian urn is probably one of his most famous poems. And it's basically an urn, something that, holds somebody's dead ashes with a bunch of Greek carvings on it. And he talks about how sad and lonely life can be. Very emo-esque, or pre-emo-esque. It purposely clashed with these things because there really hadn't been something that had been defined as common poetry. Most of the poetry prior to this era was written by the overly educated, the privileged classes. But John Keats, Coleridge, William Blake, even, these guys were artisans. They didn't come from money. However, George Gordon, Lord Byron did. Wordsworth did. Percy Bysshe Shelley did. But they hated their background. They didn't like being rich. Most of them died drunk and penniless. Percy Bysshe Shelley, for instance, went on to father a child with the early feminist, one of the early feminists in the world, and gives us Mary Shelley and Frankenstein. Frankenstein is birthed out of this romantic movement. It is a mixture of skepticism towards science and the questions of what does it mean to be human. Outside of this era in time, those questions hadn't been asked yet, and they're really being asked by these poets. So for 50 years before, they really emphasize innocence too. I forgot to mention that. The idea of innocence and not necessarily anti-intellectualism, but innocence and common sense. The idea that we all have this born in innocence, this born in common sense within us, and that we are all naturally good, naturally commonsensical, and naturally innocent. It's just that society, industrialization, getting away from our nature, destroys that. And they really express those themes. It's best on display in Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, two great books by William Blake, which also preserve his etchings. Blake is an interesting figure because he goes insane by the end of his life. He hears voices, deals with all kinds of mental issues and instabilities because he feels like he's constantly in his mind struggling between God and the devil. And that comes out in his poetry, and it's very beautiful. The beginning of the 1800s sees England trying to reclaim its past by returning to earlier forms, the Shakespearian forms, the satires of Pope. They go to the classical periods of Rome, Greece, and even early England to cull some new inspiration. The Brownings, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Matthew Arnold, Gerald Manley Hopkins, and Thomas Hardy are the major poets of this era. One of the ladies from this time period, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, is probably the second most influential female poet from Britain this early in the game. Hardy and the Irish poet W.B. Yeats emerge as the two leading poets in England. Even though Yeats is Irish, he gets lumped in with the English a lot. That's because of his enormous popularity and his common man appeal. He's he's a low man from Ireland and wins over the intellectual crowd both in England and in the United States. He's very popular in the U.S. in the 1800s. A.E. Housman would follow him. Housman enjoyed a brief period of immense popularity for his ideas of youth and doom. So he kind of harkens back a little bit to the Romantics with the idea that doom is impending to that day's youth. Reacting towards the decadence of the neoclassical period, the Georgian poets and writers bring about the first real cup of resentment to British poetic traditions into modern society. So the first part of the 1800s tries to recapture England. The second part of the 1800s seeks to reject it completely. And it happens primarily with the young poets, which is not all too uncommon. Young people come along all the time and reject the growth of their parents. And at this time period, England's colonial ways about the world has come home to roost. Think about that for a minute. If you're living on an island and here comes this English person and he's going to take your land and claim it for the British throne without your say, how would that make you feel? Not too happy, right? Well, England has been dealing with some nasty wars all over the world at this point. They are broke, and they are having to deal with that. And the young people had seen their futures already auctioned before they were even arriving on the planet. And they show up, and then they're told how to create their art. Well, the youth normally don't respond very well to that, do they? They flip the bird and they say, no, get rid of those traditions. We're going to start things all over again. Those sentimental times, the Georgians wouldn't have as large of impact as those poets who lambasted the imperial and warlike world. And this is especially prominent during World War I in the early 1900s. We've already had a taste of that in this class with Dulce et Decorum Est. This entire period of World War I poetry really flips the bird at nationalism to the English crown, English tradition, and England in general. They really were discontented, malcontented with the way literary traditions had gone before. Wilfred Owen and the short works of novelist Rudyard Kipling, who spent many of his years in India, though traditional in construction, were revolutionary in their themes and their anti-war sentiments. Definitely check either of those two gentlemen out. American influence would start to happen at this time period. So we're talking early 1900s. Think about that for a minute. 1776 is when the U.S. had declared independence. The War of 1812 was the second war that England fought with us. So almost a period of 100 years before England literary traditions finally start recognizing American literary traditions as being significant. Between the decades of World War I and World War II, so between 1920 and 1939, essentially modernism comes about. Modernism basically throws everything under the bus, runs over it, and lights it on fire. The Imagist poets come about. We've already seen them in America, but they make their way over from the U.S. to England and actually become extremely more popular in England than they were in the United States. And they bring a profound shift in traditional poetic forms. They totally disregard them altogether, for the most part. They bring new devices, new techniques, and new themes. They make things more abstract, non-traditional, and sometimes unpoetic, according to our British friends. But the conservative elite eventually have to swallow that pill. Modernism and postmodernism would be a part of British poetic tradition from the 1930s until today. It's still there in most regards. The modernist movement in England finally starts to incorporate women a lot more than any of the other periods in history. revivals of the avant-garde, Romanticism, war poetry, movement towards Irish traditions and Irish music into Irish English poetry. Scottish voices also come in as well, as they have kind of been marginalized for several hundred years. And the overall voice of England becomes more and more inclusive by the early 20th century. Poetic popularity would all see their days in vogue again. So, from the crazy epics to the satirists, the Georgian poetic traditions, the romantics, all of these come back around, and everything has a circle and a time period. And they would all appear in different ways. Modernism would play with all of them and create and recreate them into different magical forms that have reached millions now. The latter half of the 20th century, so we're talking 1990s and the early part of this 21st century, has begun to see a larger influx of women as well as more English immigrant poets. So England has a little bit more of an interesting makeup of immigrant poets than the United States. They get folks from the continent. They also get folks from the Middle East a lot more, and from Northern Africa a lot more than we see here in the United States. Those folks had been in country in England for a lot longer than they have here in the U.S. So there are some second-generation immigrant families that now are being educated and accepted into society in England, as well as throughout Western Europe. So it makes those literary traditions a lot more interesting. And that is where we're at. Modern day poetry is where we'll be at here in a few weeks, but we'll be reading into the American traditions now. So your assignment after watching this video and reading some of the English poets and bringing those to our next class, we'll go into American traditions. And where do they fall? They do predominantly come from England, obviously, because we speak English here in the United States as a predominant language. So with those English immigrants to the United States, we see a lot of those traditions, poetic forms get changed, used, and rearranged into our own American traditions. And it's there. You'll see my next video here maybe in a few days. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, there will be a discussion forum posted directly after this video. You should go there and ask questions, leave comments, or maybe even post a poem or two that we can talk about. I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Thank you.